Hey, what's up? It's Menta, and this is what we're going to be making today. Today I want to have a look at sidechained reverb in lead stacks. This is something I see a lot. People don't really understand how it works and the relationship between your dry signal and your reverb signal and how to best match those in harmony. And I'm talking about things like, the attack and release timings on the compressor, the amount of input gain that you want to put on the compressor to inflate the reverb prior to further processing at the end, and just how you can manipulate those settings in different styles of melodies to get the kind of sound you want. If you like either of these stacks, both of these are using my new preset bank, which is out now. So the link for that is in the description. If you want to use these sounds in your own tracks, everything you hear in this track, apart from these kick samples, are from my Spire bank. So I had to give a little shout out. So first of all, I've got this Porta style melody, and I've also got a big room style melody. We'll start with the Porta style melody, which is sort of my bread and butter. It's more of the stuff I would make. And that will sound like this. Right, that's my standard chain and my standard reverb sidechain that I would use on this style of melody. And it's what I like to call Porta style. It's usually what I would go for with any kind of traditional happy hardcore melody. And the way I have this set up is as follows. If we isolate the reverb very quickly, so we don't send the dry signal, we mute the delay, we just want the reverb going in here. I can explain a little bit about exactly what is going on. If we also isolate this to just the lead stack, this, you will just hear the reverb channel now. Obviously that sounds a bit weird on its own because you're only hearing effectively the sidechained reverb signal. I will add the dry back in just to illustrate it slightly better. But you can hear that's quite smooth. The way this is done is finding that balance between everything. So I go with a threshold. I mean, I can't really give you exact values because it very much depends on your input volume. So it's kind of relative, but relatively speaking, if we have a look at the meters, and I'll put this back on, the dry signal's hitting about -8, -9. The reverb is hitting around about, hovering around about -18. It's roughly, relatively, -9 again. So whatever you're going in with the dry signal, it's sort of relatively half again. And that I've found just kind of, I don't do this on a science, I spy ear, but it does usually end up being sort of around that halfway mark. So the way this works, as I say, is finding the balance, and this is where the settings come in. So you've got your threshold, your attack, and your release timings. Now the biggest thing I think people miss is the attack and release timings. The threshold is there purely the threshold and ratio are there purely to fix up the relative volume so that it's roughly half of what we're going in. And you can see this very nicely in the Fruity limiter. We've got the total value of the dry signal, and we're compressing it around about 50% in total, right? And that's a combination of the threshold and the ratio to achieve that value. It's obviously being sidechained by the dry signal. That's how we're taking the input for this compressor. Now, when it comes to attack and release timings, the easiest way to think of it is your attack is when a note in your melody is played, it's how quickly the compressor latches onto that. So how fast you want the reverb to start ducking when a note in your melody is played. And the release is how long after the note has been played do you want the compressor to lift up the reverb. And this is where you need to make the sweep happen. This is that really nice tail sweep of reverb that you hear in songs. This is what this comes from the release setting primarily. So if we play this, I have my attack set around about 47 milliseconds roughly in here. And that's mostly because I just like it to not be super abrupt. I know there's some people out there that like to use 0 milliseconds or, 0.2 or even 1 or 2 milliseconds. Really just as soon as the note plays, cut all the reverb down immediately. I like to make it a slightly smoother transition. It's nothing crazy. 40 milliseconds doesn't make that big of a difference, but to my ear, it just sounds slightly nicer. I'll try and illustrate it here. It's very subtle, but to me that just sounds quite nice. It's ever so slight though. The big one is the release, and that is, as I say, when the note stops, how long you want it to be before the compressor fully lifts off. I have this at 630 milliseconds, around that mark, and that is so that if we turn off the sidechain a moment as well, you'll get a representation. If you make this really big, like 1500 milliseconds, you'll see exactly what I mean. You see how much longer that takes to lift off? And if you make it really short, the reverb starts instantly as soon as this stops. Now, what you're going to see here, it's a very visual. If you have your release time too low, say 10 milliseconds, you'll get this horrible pulsing. And if you've ever tried to do this and it doesn't sound good, this is probably why. Can you hear that? If I turn off the dry sound, so you're just hearing just the reverb, this is what that sounds like. You're getting really abrupt transitions. You're not getting a nice smooth tail on there. And the difference is if you increase your release timing, you hear how much smoother that is. And then if you add the dry signal back in, there you have it. That is where that comes from. So to get a nice smooth tail, it's your release settings. We play everything back in here together. And you can see here, whenever this stops playing, this kind of moves up, and you can see them almost bouncing against each other in harmony. And that is roughly how I do it for my standard happy hardcore melodies. Now, when you play that in context with the sidechain on, you get this nice... I forgot everything was muted. You get this nice... this nice sort of like swell of reverb, character and air in the pockets where there's gaps in the melody, you know, like here and here. And you hear that reverb release up. Now, the other thing on that is the balance, obviously being 50%. So that when the reverb does get released by the compressor, it's not ridiculously loud in comparison to the dry signal. And what I mean by that is this is kind of where the makeup gain comes in, to push your reverb tail so that when the compressor releases it, it kind of pushes it louder than what would have gone in originally, to really help the inflation on that reverb. But if you do too much, you'll end up making it too loud, as you'll hear if I do this. There's, you know, overwhelming amounts of reverb there. You can kind of illustrate the point effectively with this as well. It's just too much reverb. So it's finding that balance of where the volume needs to be in the pockets so that you've got a loud enough, an audible reverb in the gaps, but when the lead is playing, you still have enough reverb there so that the leads don't sound dry. And you can illustrate this quite well by turning off the reverb completely and then adding it in just to see how much difference that makes. In fact, we'll cut out everything. I do have an extra reverb here that just provides some background air, but don't really worry about that for the context of this. So if you've got it completely dry, you've got this. You add the delay. And then you add this reverb. You can hear how much that reverb is doing. Now, that is obviously a standard happy hardcore melody. This is another type of melody that I've used before. And this is what I like to call a more big room sounding melody. And that sounds like this. Now notice how I switched reverb here. We've gone away from this Porta reverb and we've gone to this big room reverb. Now this is slightly different. One difference is the actual preset of the verb I'm using. I like the Palace preset, which is, it's like a large hall kind of sound, so you get a lot of character in the mids. With a big room melody, you just kind of want the air, you want the noise, you just want, you know. So I actually swapped this to a bright hall, but just something a bit brighter. I want a bit of a brighter reverb. Now, that's one thing that's different. But the main difference is in the sidechain settings for this. Now, if you remember everything we did on or spoke about on the Porta Menta melody, this is the big room style one. You're going to see some immediate differences. First of all, the gain is up way higher. Second, the threshold's way lower. And thirdly, the attack and release have been tweaked. And you'll also see the volume fader is 20 dB down instead of 8. And that's obviously for the relative volume balance again. But what you're gaining out of this is this. You can see that where before we wanted that smooth tail, because that style of melody really catered for the longer sweeps at the end. With this one, we want a lot more inflation, and we adjust the volume fader out after the fact so that it doesn't overpower. But we also want this kind of more dry signal to come through. And the reason for that, at least from my personal point of view, is that these kind of melodies work really well where as soon as the note stops, you get this insane inflated air that comes through. So the settings for this one, I've got the threshold right down. As you can see, it's dropping it around about 3/4 of the way. The makeup gain is up to plus 12 dB. And then the attack and release, I've got an 18 millisecond attack. So it's not completely instant, but it's pretty quick. And a 400 millisecond release. And that's so it's a little bit more abrupt. And if we take off the dry signal once again, you'll hear exactly what this sounds like. Let me turn off all of the basses quickly. And you can hear that that's really, really low amounts of reverb that's persistent relative to the other one, but massive lift as soon as a note stops playing. And that's intentional because it kind of almost swarms the ears. And that's the level of energy you want to bring out from this kind of a melody. So if we equip the dry signal again, you can hear how that's working just from the difference in settings. So for more big room style, you know, more aggressive, more rhythmic melodies that sat on one note, they're driving. That's the kind of reverb I want to go for with this. I want to get something with a low threshold, massive inflation, quite a quicker release time, as opposed to the more traditional melodies, which are more melodic, a lot more movement in them, where I want the reverb to have a longer sweep up and a little bit more of a persistent reverb going on all the time, so it sounds less dry overall, and a bit more surrounded by that wet sound. Whereas this is a lot more contrasty, it's a lot more aggressive and a lot more driving. So you have to play with your settings to adjust for both cases. There is also other cases. I mean, there's sort of like a lot more slow melodies where you have a lot of big gaps, you know, even bigger than the gaps I had here, in which case for those I would probably go with a sort of a hybrid between the two, with an even longer release time than I do on the Porta style reverb, so that you in those gaps get this really long sweep, you know, even like a second of release, and just kind of balance the settings around that. But in order to get that bigger release and to actually get the lift afterwards over that length of time, you need your threshold lower and your gain higher and your relative volume outside of it lower to compensate. Now, I want to show you just an interesting perspective, which is why bother? Why would you have this reverb setting for this and the other reverb setting for that? And it's a fair question. I've only showed you them in isolation, but I want to show you what happens in cases where you use the other one for not necessarily the wrong type of sound, but for a different type of sound. And neither of them are objectively better than the other, but at least in my taste, this suits this more and the other one suits the other one more. And what I mean by that is if we take a listen, if we just remove everything besides the reverb. No, actually, no, we will play it all in because it will give you a better idea in context. So if we play this whole drop again with this big room reverb, and you'll hear it's quite a clean sound. And in fact, I can show you in here just how clean it comes through on the spectrogram. You've got clear indications here of where it's very dense, where the lead plays, and then you've got this like lifting reverb in the gaps, and you can see the lift on the reverb that comes in those gaps. And if you change that to the Porta style reverb that we used at the start, here, listen to what happens. On first listen, you think, oh, that sounds quite good. But if you look at the detail, if you start really thinking about it, I think that sounds way more messy. Because the reverb isn't lifting up nearly as much, it's releasing slower, and the overall threshold means that the relative volume of the reverb while the lead is playing is higher. You end up with this kind of messy sounding reverb. And you can also confirm that in millimeters as well. You can see there's a little bit more density in the gaps because the reverb's providing more. Now, if you go between them, A, B, you'll hear a bit closer to what I mean. It's definitely a matter of taste, but to me, the big room style settings sound way better for this kind of a melody. And the reason for that is because that inflation is just so much more in the gaps, and it helps the reverb and the synth sound itself contrast better, drive more, sounds more aggressive, and it also sounds way cleaner. The other one, it's kind of a matter of preference. The other one sounds fine, I think. It's just a little bit more messy. It's got a bit of intensity to it, but it's almost swarming a little too much. And I mean, you can just land somewhere in the middle. You could tweak the settings a little bit more, and you could hybridize it and make it work. But it's just to illustrate that there are both these options. And if we go back to this original melodic style Porta melody, which sounded like this. If we swap over to the big room style settings for the sidechain on this, have a look at what happens. There's too much lift in the gaps and not enough persistence when the lead is actually playing. It's a very interesting dynamic where these settings don't really work for this kind of melody. That much more persistence and that much smoother lift at the end just gives that overall feeling of just a glued reverb. It's a tighter mix on it. And it's very interesting. So that is a combination of sidechained reverb compression for different styles of melody and why different settings work for different melodies. So there you have it. I hope this helps in some way. And I hope it's cleared up maybe some misconceptions and also just your understanding. I've tried to make it sort of as simple as possible in what settings do and how it interacts with the melody. You've got to kind of think about it from two perspectives. You've got to think about it from what is going to suit the melody, but also what is your ultimate goal for the style of reverb you're looking for on this particular drop you're writing. But anyway, I hope this helped. And until next time, I'll see you later. Cheers, guys.